when I first saw the establishment of the Productivity Insights Network, I was very interested, took a quick look at it and started looking at some of the papers that were the early papers being produced, and was very impressed with the quality of those, and made contact. I'm impressed because we're a very small operation, and we've got a well-developed track of begging, stealing, borrowing, plagiarising, anything we can find globally, and the PIN network looks like it's going to be a productive scene for our miners. We'll be working on it. Look, what Philip asked me to talk about is it's going to be rather more descriptive, I think, than the more philosophical and analytical pieces that we had earlier. But it'll take you through how we work, why we do it, the way we do it, and so forth, and the relative merits, particularly of the deep dive inquiry approach that we take, and largely borrowed from the Australians, but developed in its own way, versus some of the higher level macro research, which we do some of, but not certainly not the major part of our business. I should start with a little bit of context, and that relates to. There we go. That relates to sort of the historical setting of the New Zealand economy. Tiny economy, about as far away as you can get. But through the first half of the last century, developing living standards that were probably near the top in the world, around typically rating 4th or 5th globally, and really heavily reliant on those post-colonial ties to Britain, which provided access to capital, expertise, networks, and essentially an open access to the British market for largely agricultural products. About 2/3 of our exports in the 1960s were coming to the UK. So it really demonstrates the power of networks, because you couldn't think of a more inconvenient market to get to in terms of distance and the rest of it. By the 1960s, that model was really beginning to come under stress, and as we stand here today thinking about Brexit, I can't help think back to when I was studying and beginning my career, and the topic of the day amongst the economics profession in New Zealand and the business community was not Brexit, but entry into the European Common Market, which dominated discussions through New Zealand for a very long time because of the impact that it was likely to have and did have on access. If I can allow myself a diversion on this, when I first went to my first conference of the New Zealand Association of Economists, I discovered a tradition that had been there through the 60s and was still running, and that was at the end of the conference dinner, or during the conference dinner, a senior member of the profession would stand and make usually a fairly lively and entertaining speech, which finished with a toast to Le Général, which was General de Gaulle, for his unstinting efforts at keeping Britain out of Europe. I doubt that we'll be making the same speeches to Theresa May or Jacob Rees-Mogg, but there we go. The model, as I said, was starting to fray, and it was beginning to fray for a whole bunch of reasons. Limiting access to Britain, increased agricultural protection everywhere, export subsidies, which were very damaging, and a couple of oil shocks. And that really started to lay bare a domestic policy strategy which had been aimed at supporting incomes in the face of really declining circumstances everywhere. And that model, which included all manner of regulatory interventions, an attempt to build a domestic manufacturing base behind protective walls, which were very expensive, and really began to unwind even the internationally competitive sectors of the economy by laying across some of these very expensive interventions. It all blew up in 1984, around the time of an election, and we had a major currency run, a new government, and a very reformist government, which did what most economists tend to regard as things that needed to be done. It was a comprehensive package that took out a lot of the protection, went through fiscal policy, monetary policy, regulatory policy, privatisation, part privatisation, corporatisation, all of those sorts of things. It was a very rapid, comprehensive program. If you look at this graph, which is relative GDP, what you see is that long slide, this one from 1950. And from about 1990, when the effects of that reform program were running through, what we managed to do was to stabilise the decline. We haven't managed to create convergence back to sort of the levels that we would like to achieve and against our normal comparators, particularly the Aussies. And that's an important comparison. One, they're tough because they had 30 years of unbroken growth. Secondly, open labour markets, and when we fall behind the Australians too far, people move, and that's not a good place to be. So what we managed to fix was a whole bunch of older problems. What it's told us is that pursuing productivity is not a one-shot exercise. You've got to keep working at it. And now we look at it again and try to resolve what we need to do. Now, whenever I talk about or think about productivity and what you need to do, my starting point is you better get the basics right. You better have monetary policy right, fiscal policy right, regulatory policy, and all of those sorts of things. And actually, we do that pretty well. We've been running fiscal surpluses now for a long period of time. Monetary policy is pretty well sorted. When you look at various surveys that float around the world on ease of doing business, you'll find New Zealand near the top of the list. Lack of corruption, New Zealand at the top of the list. Property and human rights, right there. So all of those sorts of things look well, and this is an OECD analysis, which I'm always a bit wary of some of the composite indicators, but it tries to relate the quality of structural policy to GDP per capita. And what you discover here is, yes, of course, there's a relationship. And there's this little country down on the far right there, which is an absolute outlier, with structural policies that look like they're probably about 20% above the OECD average on their composite indicator. But income's about 20% below where the average, which means that we're a long way off that predicted path. So what on earth is going on? Just one further bit of material before we move on to where we're at now. There's a sense of the last 20 years, why haven't we had more urgency around this issue? And there's a little distraction here, and that is that if you take just GDP growth itself, it's been growing on pretty well. We've gone through a GFC without too many problems. You need to add in there shortly after the GFC, the Christchurch earthquake, which with property damage and other infrastructural damage, about 20% of GDP in total, swallowed and managed and still coming through. So why not the urgency? Well, growth's been moving on. It's been growing on the back of very strong population growth, immigration and natural population growth. The job market works pretty well. We've taken a lot of people into the market. Labour force participation rates are very high. If you look at hours worked, very high. So total growth looks all right. Household income supported by high employment and high hours worked. But productivity still modest. So that's the challenge that we've been working our way through. So 2008 election, new government agreed to create or decided to create a productivity commission modelled on the Australians. Went through the parliament, supported by pretty much across the whole board. The only party that didn't support it was the Greens, who had about 5% of the vote at the time. Broad support. It's established under its own Act of Parliament. It's an independent Crown entity, which is a class of arm's length bodies that we have in New Zealand, which includes things like the Commerce Commission, which is the competition regulator, and the Electoral Commission, which does things with boundaries and running elections and so on. So our own Act of Parliament, a budget appropriation which is pretty small, $5 million, and so about £2.6 million, not huge. 15 to 20 staff we can do with that, plus short-term contractors and consultants and secondees and so on. Overseen and governed by 3 part-time commissioners, including me. It doesn't feel part-time sometimes, but there you go. And all of the standard public sector reporting and accountability and audit requirements, and in our parlance, the Minister of Finance is the ownership minister, so responsible for how this thing operates. The Act states our purpose is, as you see it there, providing advice to the government on improving productivity, directed to the overall well-being of New Zealanders, having regard to a wide range of communities of interest and population groups. So it's not just a simple, how do we get GDP per capita back up, or a simple productivity measure. It's a broader sweep than that, bringing in other elements of social, environmental well-being and so forth. And we have to think about that. We've avoided trying to define it specifically ourselves as to what do we mean by well-being, but we certainly pay a lot of attention to environmental impacts and distributional impacts and other such things as we go about our work. The Act also specifies our functions, and the first one is to conduct inquiries and report on productivity-related matters, as referred by responsible ministers, and I'll deal with that in a minute. Undertake and publish research about productivity-related matters and promote public understanding on productivity-related matters. The Act also requires us to act independently in our work. Now, as we were first established, and the Minister at the time, Bill English, later Prime Minister, we were chatting about, well, what did he expect out of us? And he made one point, and he said, look, I've got a bookshelf full of learned reports on productivity, and I can't do anything with them. There's nothing actionable in there. We've thought about this for a long time, and I want to be able to make progress, and it's going to be bite by bite. We're going to do it piece by piece. And that means I want you to concentrate on these inquiries. I want specific, actionable recommendations, stuff that we can work with. And that was his approach to this. I thought that was fine. I was a little surprised later to discover that he'd backed his view by instructing that our funding would come to us in 2 buckets, 90% for inquiries, 10% for research, which doesn't leave a lot of research capacity, I have to say. So the topics that we get to work on are referred by ministers. When the Act was being debated in the Parliament, there was a question about whether we shouldn't be picking our own topics. Wouldn't that give you independent commission a better run at the issues? The argument that came back the other way, and particularly from Gary Banks, who was then head of the Australian Productivity Commission and advising on the establishment of the New Zealand Commission, Gary argued that if ministers propose the topics, then you'll have skin in the game. You're much more likely to get them to respond to the inquiries. And I think he was right on that, having watched the progress of our work since then. So cabinet ministers ultimately choose the topic. They seek advice from others as to what are suitable topics, including their own departments and agencies. They have actually advertised in the media at one stage for topics. They talk to the opposition even occasionally. It's a fairly congenial sort of public. The Treasury runs this process. They've currently got a long list of about 40 or 50 topics, which is more than we'll cope with for a long time. The trick is to ensure that they're not too random and that there's a coherence about them, and that's what we've been working through. The Act requires that the government must consult with us before a terms of reference is finalised, and that's really about making sure, one, we understand what it is they're trying to get at, and two, that we have an opportunity to tell them that looks intractable, or do you really want us to go there because this is where it's likely to take us. But that's a pretty constructive dialogue normally. So that sets us off, a couple of inquiries running in parallel at any time. Each one takes 12 to 15 months to complete. We typically have 5 or 6 analysts on an inquiry. We're able to contract specialist researchers, contractors, and increasingly these days second from relevant government departments someone to work with us. And we do that for a couple of reasons. One, it's cheap labour, and that's important. Two, they've typically got access to what's already been done within the agency that's relevant and gives us quick access to that. But secondly, it means that we effectively have an ambassador when the secondment is over, when the inquiry's done and they've gone back into their agency. If you're trying to get stuff grounded and working, they know why it turned out the way it turned out. The inquiry has a standard sequence. Typically you take your terms of reference and then within 6 or 8 weeks you'd issue an issues paper, which is maybe 50 to 70 pages. It lays out our interpretation of the terms of reference, how we're going to go about it. Quite a lot of contextual stuff. What do we know about sort of the broad area that this subject is all about? And normally it would have within it a range of questions. These are the sorts of questions we think we're going to have to answer in order to deal with this terms of reference. That goes out, makes the first call for submissions and for stakeholders, people with an interest to identify themselves. While that's going on, we're busy starting a major literature search. We're designing and contracting research of different sorts. Where do we need extra data? How do we get it? What sort of hypotheses we're going to test in the course of doing this work? What are we trying to look at here? Where do we think this is going, and what do we need to understand? About 2/3 of the way through the process, an exposure draft is issued, and that's pretty complete with recommendations and findings in it. And that's again another sort of call for submissions and engagement. What have we got right? What have we missed? What have we overcooked, undercooked, whatever? So it's a quality test and a sort of a reality test, if you like. All of the submissions, and we get a lot of them, I think, very high quality typically. Those are all published on our website as they come in. Typically we would hand the final report after it's gone through that second testing round 12 to 15 months after we've started. The Act requires that when we hand a report to the referring ministers, they're obliged to table it in the Parliament as soon as possible. There's no, or as soon as practicable. There's no formal obligation on them to respond or to do anything with it at all. So the challenge is on us to try to make it credible and authoritative enough and convincing enough that it's hard to ignore. And working with the stakeholders as we go through this process, if we've got that right, then we will typically help build the constituency for action around it. There's no requirement to do so, but governments have fallen into the practice of giving a formal public response, so recommendation by recommendations to how they expect to respond. They'll be pretty clear about which ones they're rejecting, and they do that regularly. Which ones they're accepting or accepting in part, how they're going to go about it, or how they're dealing with it. There's also extensive peer review, focus group evaluations, and all the rest of it, and that's all published as well. And typically after we've completed these things, we spend quite a lot of time briefing not just government and officials and ministers, but also opposition parties if they're interested, and they typically are. So we try to keep that going as well. No engagement with ministers through the process. We stay well away from that. So what sorts of things do you get to do, or do we get to do? That's a listing of the 12 inquiries that we've completed to date. The first one we started with was on housing affordability, which was an issue in New Zealand as it has been in a number of other places. And kind of an interesting issue to start with because it is so multidimensional. And as you look through that list, you'll see that the dimensions that were identified in that first report have sparked a whole lot of follow-up reports. So local government regulatory performance, local government does most of the planning and regulation around new construction and so on. Using land for housing, same story, constraints on the availability of housing, pushing up housing affordability issues. Better urban planning, the same one, trying to come back at that. And in fact, the current inquiries underway include local government funding and financing, which again is a flow out of that because one of the major constraints is around how do we fund the infrastructure necessary to accommodate growth. So diversions into quite a broad range of subjects, social sector, tertiary education, and low emissions economy was really about how do you make the transition from where we're at in terms of our total carbon emissions through to where we've set targets to get to. And that was really a response to governments having signed up to numerous international agreements about where they're going to go, but actually having no idea how to get there. And it was, how do you just lay this out in a very pragmatic and practical fashion of the sorts of steps you would need to take to hit the targets of net zero by 2050. The other one that we're working on, just started, is really around technical disruption and the future of work, which is the sort of topic that you expect to see these days. So a few lessons. Well, getting the right topics matters a lot, and so far I think ministers and officials have been pretty keen to give us stuff, and that's really about topics that are suited to our sorts of processes, substantial issues, generally complex and cross-cutting, where we have a comparative advantage, particularly cutting across some of the departmental silos. The ministerial skin in the game, I think, matters, as I said before, and helps give these things relevance. The independence is critical to the way we work. I think it allows us a different sort of discussion with stakeholders and with the public than officials would normally be able to sustain. We're not obliged to defend current policy, which is often a difficulty for officials. So it's a different sort of model. Communication becomes increasingly challenging, I think. The traditional media are less and less able to and interested in carrying these more complex issues, so we've got to find other ways through social media, direct engagement and so on. Do a lot of time speaking to audiences. Nothing works better than standing up in front of an audience. It's hard work and you've got to cover a lot of ground, but my goodness, it works a lot better. I think we're discovering that core agency capacity to respond can be problematic, and the incentives to respond can also be problematic. I don't think we could cope with trying to do more than we do at present. What we call after-sales service is a challenge as well. You put out a report and the teams immediately get reshaped and move on to the next topic, and you've got a subject that often is going to be there with a set of recommendations which will be in play for quite a few years. And in fact, even at this point, we've got recommendations from our very first inquiry still making their way through Parliament. Just those are the sorts of lags that exist. And however well you do peer review and all the rest of it, actually trying to assess the impact is very challenging. I'd love to be able to say that, my goodness, look at that, productivity in New Zealand is increasing, but even if it was, which is hard to know, you've got some very big attribution issues. So research, as I said, very limited funding, and so how do you deal with that? Well, you try to reach into other people's pockets. So we created what we call a productivity hub, very much like the PIN network, lined up with our Treasury, Statistics New Zealand, the official agency, and our Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, pooled research, pooled funding into a hub budget, basically. Undertook a stock take of existing research, gap analysis, identification of research priorities. Looks an awful lot like what PIN has been doing. Started contracting researchers, looking for multi-year programs so that we could really get some stuff going. We have in New Zealand a key asset in a very extensive firm-level longitudinal database. It covers virtually all firms down to the very, very small. Covers their employees and worker movement between firms. It links to the tax data and is a pretty useful asset to be working with. That's given us some insights which I think go well beyond what we could achieve through the standard macro type analysis. And we've spent a lot of time trying to create a productivity narrative, trying to give a coherent and accessible description and analysis of the nature of the productivity issues, the likely contributing factors, and helping them through that to define research priorities, but also to try and refine our communications. So we've just been refreshing our research agenda. And this is just a quick squiz through the 4 elements of it. The narrative, trying to sort of tell the story, looking back at firm level productivity research to draw the bigger picture story out of that, and the framework for thinking about lifting productivity at the firm level. Why aren't they making improvements? Why do we have these big gaps? What are the interventions that might help get us there? Resource allocation, really around firm and labour market dynamics and the allocation of resources, how readily that's working. Spatial perspectives on firm performance, trying to understand that, and really trying to get a better sense of the effect of taxes and interest rates and exchange rates on performance and the dynamics in the firm market. Management and workplace performance. Management capacity, which I don't think we've really got a strong handle on, and an understanding of how important that might be, and again, what you would do about it. Experimenting with different sorts of management interventions. Workforce performance, public policies, looking at things like fair pay, collective bargaining, education systems, particularly the vocational system, which is under serious review right now. And finally, in that block, really trying to build some research capacity, because with a database of the sort we've got, a micro database, there aren't a lot of people who can really make good use of it, so you need to invest on that. As I said, this is a few sort of pet themes of mine that I've been toying with and will be worked back into that research agenda. Getting the basics matters, I said earlier, and that's still where I start, but if we go beyond that, competition intensity, very small markets, small isolated regional markets, hard to build economies of scale and retain competition, and that's a challenge for us all the way through. Very low participation in international value chains, which is an issue for us. A lot of the stuff we do comes sort of straight off the farm through the processing system and into foreign markets. It's not really feeding into those more complex value chains. Trade openness is smaller or less than you might expect in comparable small developed economies when we look at that. And that whole tradables, non-tradables argument is one that sits there with us. And our larger firm structures, the ones where you expect to have a higher degree of international engagement, a higher degree of foreign participation of various sorts, well, it's dominated in our case by SOEs and by producer-owned cooperatives, both of whom have compromised governance structures and both of whom have struggles with access to capital, particularly the co-ops who want to hang on to ownership and get very wary about outside capital. So there's some challenges there about how those big firms manage, and also for our other large firms, many of them foreign-owned, who are not coming to New Zealand to use New Zealand as a base to expand into the world. It's wrap up the domestic market, and that's as far as they want to go. So lack of dynamism there. Capital intensity, normally we're pretty light in what's shaping those capital labour choices. We'll be working our way through that. We have had for a long time comparatively high real interest rates, and trying to understand why and what you would do about that. And some of the other labour market dynamics, a very flexible market, in many respects it works very well, attracts a lot of people into employment, but increasingly with high immigration as well, we're going into lower wage and a high employment model. Innovation policy, big gaps between leading and lagging domestic firms, and also big gaps between the domestic and international frontiers, and trying to understand why those gaps persist and what interventions are available to improve technological diffusion. And increasingly important, coming more to the fore, understanding and valuing natural capital. In many respects, it's still a resource-based economy. Even things like tourism and the film industry, which are quite large, end up being resource-based to some degree. How to better incorporate those sustainable natural capital considerations into decision-making, and coming down the track, in fact right on top of us now, climate change, both mitigation and adaptation will be a major issue. On the mitigation side, substantial redundancies of capital if we're going to make the transition to a low emissions structure. And on the adaptation side, things like rising sea levels and flood-prone problems mean big investments in protection or managed retreat, which is still to be sorted out. Our Treasury has launched into thinking about its objectives in terms of a well-being context, which is an interesting framework which is developing and working its way through. What's got us scratching our heads right now is, in that framework, how do we think about productivity? I think we all understand that whatever framework you're using, however you define well-being, productivity is still at the heart of lifting well-being. That's fine. But what are the metrics we need to be thinking about, and how do we work our way through that? That will have to follow after the Treasury has developed its framework to a higher degree, and that's a topic for us to consider. And then, you know, the usual things that we worry about in a place like New Zealand about economic geography. Internet technology is clearly not triumphing over distance and scale. Those agglomeration benefits are powerful, which is a challenge when you're as small as we are. And what sort of strategies might strengthen, sorry, there's a misprint there, the benefit from technology and ease the disadvantages of distance. Some concluding comments. Look, we've been at this for 8 years now. I think we're now regarded as a settled and essential part of the public policy infrastructure in New Zealand. I don't think there's any doubt that the advent of the Commission has brought a degree of focus and energy to what had been a long neglected field, and that's welcome. I'm in no doubt at all that a stronger research effort and more of the macro analysis would assist us considerably in enhancing our impact, and also in helping to shape our inquiry work, both what topics we go after and how we think about the nature of the issues we should be pursuing in there. The capacity to work right across departmental silos, I think, is a major strength. Most of our work ends up having to start going through broad systems thinking to get to where we need to get to. There is a risk in all of this that we crowd out what should be going on in departments, and I think there is a bit of an element of that. I don't think we have anything like the in-depth and quality of policy research going on within our core departments that we once had, and I think there's a bit of a tendency to look to us to replace that, which is, I think, a risk that we should try to avoid. Impact assessment is a struggle, but the general point I think that I would come back to is that an independent body producing robust and evidence-based analysis is kind of important in a confused and increasingly confusing world. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.